You need to learn your place, old woman. A black woman does not come into my courtroom and open her mouth at me.
He said it loud from his high bench, so the whole room heard him crush a 74-year-old black grandmother. She was already on her knees on the marble, reaching for a brass pocket watch that had just shattered at her feet. But the judge only smiled.
Look at you, right down there where you belong. Now pick out what it takes.
The bailiff hauled her up by the arm. Then the handcuffs came out, cold steel on two thin brown wrists whose only crime was the color of her skin.
But that judge had just made the last mistake of his career. He didn't know it yet. Let me take you back. 2 hours before it all came apart.
It was a Tuesday morning in the middle of January, and the town of Brightwater was buried in snow, the kind of snow that muffles everything. It sat heavy on the rooftops and bent the branches of the old maple trees along Delacroix Street. Smoke curled from the chimneys. The sidewalks were shoveled into narrow paths, and the whole street felt slow and quiet, the way a small town feels when the cold keeps everyone close to home. At the end of the block stood a narrow blue house with white shutters and a porch swing frozen stiff. It had been there a long time, 45 years to be exact. That was how long Cora May Bishop had lived in it. Inside, an old hymn played on the radio, and the house smelled like coffee and cinnamon. Cora was 74 years old, a small woman with silver hair pinned back and glasses that sat low on her nose. She had been a seamstress her whole working life. 35 years sewing robes for the Mount Olive Church choir, hemming wedding dresses, fixing zippers for half the town. Her hands were bent now, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, but they still knew how to thread a needle in one try. On the wall by the kitchen hung her whole life in photographs. Her wedding day, her late husband, Samuel, in his Sunday suit, the choir standing proud in robes she had stitched by hand, and in the middle of them all, one photo in a gold frame, a tall black woman in a long black robe, standing on marble steps, one hand raised, being sworn in. That was her daughter, Naomi Bishop. And just 11 days earlier, Naomi had been sworn in as the new Chief Justice of the state. But you would never guess any of that by looking at Cora. She didn't dress fancy, she didn't drive a nice car. She wore a wool coat that was 20 years old, and a scarf her granddaughter had knitted her. To the people on Delacroix Street, she was just Miss Cora, the woman who left soup on your porch when you were sick and remembered every child's birthday on the block. And that morning, Miss Cora had somewhere she needed to be. There was a letter on her kitchen table. She had read it so many times the fold was going soft. It was a notice from the county. It said her house had a code violation and an unpaid lien of $4,000, and if she didn't appear in court and pay, she could lose the property. Cora had never gotten a warning, never gotten a first letter. Just this one, stamped and cold, demanding money she didn't owe for a violation she couldn't understand. She had made calls. She had gone to the county office twice and stood in line in the cold. Every clerk said the same thing. "There's nothing we can do, ma'am. You'll have to see the judge." So she folded her documents into a worn envelope, her deed, her tax receipts, all 45 years of them, a letter from her pastor. She had done everything right, and she had the papers to prove it. Then she did one more thing. She went to the drawer by her bed and took out a small brass pocket watch. It had belonged to Samuel. He had carried it every day of their marriage, and it still ticked, soft and steady, all these years after he was gone. She wrapped it in a handkerchief and slipped it into her coat pocket. "For courage," she whispered, the way she always did. Across the street, her neighbor was scraping ice off a windshield. He looked up and waved. Cora waved back, then made her way slow and careful down the shoveled path toward the bus stop. She was 74. She had done nothing wrong. She was just going to court to fix a mistake. She had no idea that the man waiting behind that bench had already looked at her name and her neighborhood and made up his mind about her before she ever walked through the door. 3 miles across town, in the Harmon County Courthouse, a judge named Franklin Vance was pouring himself coffee in his chambers. He was 48, tall, gym-built, with a jaw that stayed clenched even when he smiled. He had sat on the bench for 9 years, and in those 9 years, he had learned one thing above all, that inside his courtroom, he was king. Nobody argued with him. Nobody could. What he said became true the moment he said it. He looked at the day's docket and let out a bored breath. Delacroix Street, he muttered, reading the address. The old part of town. He shook his head like the words left a taste in his mouth. These people. In and out, 2 minutes each. Standing near the door was his bailiff, a young man named Kyle Danner, 26, new to the job, quiet. The kind of officer who followed orders and kept his eyes down. He said nothing. At a small desk in the corner sat a law clerk named Theo Alvarez, barely a year out of school, sorting files. He heard the way the judge said these people, and something in his stomach turned. But he was new, and he was nobody, so he said nothing either. Not yet. Vance drained his cup and cracked his neck to one side. Let's get this over with. He didn't bother to read the file. He already knew everything he thought he needed to know. He walked out toward the bench like a man walking to a throne, and down the marble hallway. The elevator doors were just opening, and a small woman in a 20-year-old coat was stepping out. The courtroom was cold and echoing, all dark wood and hard benches under a high ceiling. Cora sat in the front row with her envelope of documents held tight in both hands. When they called her name, she stood slowly, her knees stiff from the cold, and walked to the front. She stood very straight. She had taught herself long ago how to hold her head up in rooms that didn't want her there. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said. Vance looked at her, really looked, up and down, taking in her dark skin and her old coat and her worn shoes, the way you look at something you've already decided has no worth. "You're here for the lien, $4,000. You paying it today or not?" "Your Honor, I don't believe I owe it. I have my papers here, my deed, my tax receipts, going back 45. I didn't ask for your life story." His voice was flat and cold. "I asked if you have the money." "Sir, if you would just look at my documents, I think you'll see there's been a mistake. Approach and hand them to the clerk, and don't talk." She stepped forward, careful on the slick floor, and held out her envelope with both hands. Theo came around to take it. Their eyes met for a second, and he saw how her hands trembled. He carried the papers up to the bench. Vance took them without a glance. He set them to the side of his desk, like they weren't even there. He had not read one single page. And Cora, standing alone on that cold marble, began to understand. This man had decided about her before she opened her mouth. The papers didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. Something older and uglier than a lien was happening in this room, and she was standing in the middle of it. "Stand there," Vance said, "and stay standing." So she stood. 1 minute. 2, 5. He shuffled papers, took a call on his desk phone, made her wait while her knees ached and her back began to burn. She shifted her weight, and his head snapped up. "Did I say you could move?" "No, sir. My knees. Everybody stands in my courtroom until I say otherwise." "Everybody." He looked at her over his glasses. "Especially somebody who comes in here trying to argue with the law. An old woman with arthritis, forced to stand on marble, while a man half her age looked for a reason to break her. And here is the thing that made it worse. Her case was clean. Anyone who read those papers would have seen it in 30 seconds. The lien was a mistake, tied to the wrong address, pushed through by a developer who wanted her whole block cleared for new construction. A fair judge would have thrown it out and apologized. Franklin Vance was not a fair judge. He picked up her deed, glanced at it for half a second, and threw it back down. "You people come in here from that side of town with a grocery bag full of paper and think that changes what you are. You people." Cora felt the words land somewhere deep and old. She knew that phrase. She had known it her whole life, and she knew exactly what it meant when a man like him said it to a woman like her. "Sir," she said quietly, "I have lived in that house for 45 years. My husband and I saved 8 years to buy it. I don't care where you live or how you got there." He leaned forward. "You're wasting my time, and your kind always thinks the clock stops for you. Your kind." The clock on the wall ticked on, and in the corner, the law clerk Theo looked up at something above the judge's head and went completely still. "You want to know your real problem," Vance said. "A black woman like you always thinks the rules bend for her. You think you can walk into a room like this, looking the way you look, dressed the way you're dressed, and be treated the same as everybody else in here. You think you belong. You don't." And there it was. The whole thing, out in the open now. Cora closed her eyes for just a moment, because she had heard those exact words her entire life, in 100 different mouths, always meaning one thing. She had heard them in 1965, a girl not allowed to try on a dress in the front of the store because of the color of her hands. She had heard them in 1974, when a clerk followed her down every aisle of a fabric shop, sure she was there to steal. She had heard them in 1981, when she and Samuel sat in a bank asking for a loan on the blue house, and the officer looked at them and said, "This might be more than your kind can handle." She had heard them in 1996, at a college front desk. "Are you sure this is the right program for someone like you?" The words changed shape over 60 years, but they always meant the same thing: you don't belong here. She opened her eyes. She was still standing in that cold courtroom, and the man on the bench was still looking at her like she was nothing. But she lifted her chin, and her voice came out steady and clear. "Your Honor," she said, "I have belonged everywhere I have ever stood, including right here. Now I am asking you respectfully to read my papers." His jaw went tight, and his eyes went hard. And that was the moment it stopped being about a lien at all. Up in the corner, near the ceiling, a small red light glowed steady. Theo Alvarez had noticed it. It was the courtroom's audio recording system, and it was on, fully on, capturing every word, every insult, in the judge's own voice. Vance had told the staff that morning that this docket was informal and the recording could stay off. Someone had forgotten to flip the switch, or maybe no one had dared. Either way, that little red light was recording everything. Theo's heart began to pound. He didn't move, he just watched, and he remembered. And at her stenography machine below the bench sat Marcy Delgado, 28 years on the job, fingers on the keys. She had typed for 100 judges, good ones and bad ones. But in all those years, she had never seen anything like this. A proud old black woman, standing straight, while a judge tried to bury her alive for the color of her skin. Marcy kept typing, every word, exactly as it was said. The insults too, especially the insults. Neither of them said a thing out loud, but in that cold room, two quiet people had just started doing the one thing that would end Franklin Vance. He had no idea. He was too busy enjoying himself. "Bailiff," Vance said, "search that bag she's carrying. People from that part of town, you never know what they bring into a courthouse." Cora's purse was a small tan one, worn soft at the corners. Her granddaughter had saved up to buy it. "Your Honor," she said, "there's nothing in my bag but—" "Bailiff." Danner stepped forward. He looked sick about it, but he did what he was told. He took her purse and turned it upside down over the clerk's table. Everything spilled out. A small bottle of pills, a folded grocery list, $2 in change, a packet of tissues, a photograph of Samuel in his Sunday suit. A whole small private life, dumped out and picked over in front of a room full of strangers. And then, from the side pocket, wrapped in its handkerchief, the brass pocket watch tumbled loose. Time seemed to slow. Cora reached for it on instinct, her hand out, her mouth already shaping the word please, but it was too far. The watch slipped from the cloth, struck the edge of the table, and dropped. It hit the marble floor, and the glass face shattered, and the ticking stopped. 40 years of soft, steady ticking. Samuel's watch. The last piece of him she could hold in her hand. Silent now, in pieces on a courtroom floor. Cora made a sound then, not a word. Just a small, terrible breath, and she went down onto her knees on the cold marble to gather what was left. Vance looked at her down there on the floor, and he smiled. "I don't know what kind of people raised you," he said, loud enough for the whole room. "But a woman like you does not walk into my courtroom and talk back to me. Look at you now. If that trinket mattered so much, you'd have kept it at home. Pick up your junk and crawl out of my court if you have to." The room went dead silent. A few people gasped, and somewhere near the back, a chair scraped, and a woman stood up. Her name was Harriet Cole. She was 70 years old, retired now, but for 4 decades she had been a legal aid attorney in this county, and she knew a violation of the law and a violation of human decency when she saw both at once. "Your Honor," Harriet said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, "that lien is invalid on its face. Under County Code Section 12-40, no property may be liened without 30 days written notice, and this woman received none. You have the power to dismiss it right now. What you do not have the power to do, what no robe on this earth gives you the power to do, is speak to a human being the way you just spoke to her. Vance's head whipped toward her, his face going red. And who are you? I'm someone who read the law, Harriet said, which is more than you've done all morning, and I'm someone who heard every word you just said to that woman. The courtroom held its breath. And Vance, humiliated in his own kingdom, did what small men with power always do. He reached for the only weapon he had left. One more word out of you, he said, jabbing a finger, and you'll be in a cell right next to her. Sit down. Harriet Cole did not sit down fast enough. That's it, Vance snapped. Bailiff, both of them. I'm holding this woman in contempt of court. He pointed at Cora, still on her knees, still gathering the broken pieces of her husband's watch. Contempt, he said, for disrupting my courtroom and refusing my lawful orders. Take her into custody. Now. It was a lie, and every soul in that room knew it. She had disrupted nothing. She had asked him to read her papers. She had knelt to pick up a watch he ordered dumped on the floor. But a judge in his own courtroom can speak a lie and make it real in a single breath, and Franklin Vance had just done exactly that. Dana froze. For one long second, the young bailiff stood there, staring at a 74-year-old woman on her knees, and something in his face fought against something else. But the judge was watching him, and the badge on his own chest suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. He stepped forward, took her by the arm, and pulled her up, her shoulder wrenched. She stumbled on her bad knees. One shoe came half off her foot, and the handcuffs came out, cold steel closing around two thin, swollen wrists that had never in 74 years done a single thing to deserve them. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She looked back once at the pieces of the watch scattered across the marble, the little brass gears catching the light, and she let two silent tears run down her face. And that is where this story began. 2 hours later, right back where we started. Except now you know how she got there, and you know it was never about a lien at all. They walked her out through a side door and down a long, cold hallway. Her one loose shoe scraped the floor, her wrists throbbed inside the cuffs, and as she walked, the tears kept coming, quiet, steady, running down into the collar of her 20-year-old coat. But here is the thing you have to understand about Cora May Bishop. She was not crying for herself. She was crying because she knew. She knew this happened to people who looked like her every single day. People with no lawyer in the gallery. People with no daughter to call. People dragged out of courtrooms and thrown into cells for the crime of being black and asking a question. And no one ever heard about it, and no one ever came. She had a room full of witnesses. A retired attorney had stood up for her. A red light had been recording the whole time. Most people had none of that. So she cried for them. For the ones who stood alone on cold floors, while men in robes looked at them like they didn't belong. That was who she was thinking about, as they walked her toward the holding cell. And it was that same thought that would soon change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The holding cell was small and grey, with a metal bench and a smell of old bleach. They took the cuffs off. She rubbed her wrists slowly, watching the red rings darken to bruise. Her shoulder ached where Dana had pulled her. Her knees were scraped raw from the marble. She sat down on the cold bench, folded her hands in her lap, and waited, because there was nothing else to do. Back in the courtroom, Marcy Delgado printed a copy of the transcript before she left her station, the true one, every ugly word, and folded it into her own bag. When a supervisor came by and told her to clean up the record and strike the old woman's polite words, Marcy looked him dead in the eye and said, "The record stands exactly as it happened. Every word he said. I typed all of it." Theo Alvarez went straight to the media room and made sure the audio file from that morning was saved. Saved again. Backed up to a second drive. His hands shook the whole time, but he did it. And young Kyle Dana, the bailiff, the one who had looked away, could not make himself leave the hallway outside her cell. Through the small window he could see the old woman sitting there, calm as still water, her bruised wrists in her lap. She looked up and met his eyes. She didn't look angry, she looked disappointed, like she'd seen his kind before, the ones who watch a wrong thing happen to a person like her and choose silence. He looked away first. In the cell, Cora closed her eyes, and she whispered one word, so quietly that only God and the grey walls could hear it. Naomi. An hour passed before anyone let her make a phone call. They finally brought her to a small room with a phone on the wall. 2 minutes, the officer said. Cora lifted the receiver with a hand that still trembled and dialed a number she had known by heart for 40 years. The number of the little girl she had raised in the blue house on Delacroix Street. The girl who had promised her mother, long ago, that she would always pick up when Mama called. 2 rings. Mama? The voice was warm, surprised. Everything all right? Naomi. Cora's voice cracked on her daughter's name. Just a little, just enough. 200 miles away, in the state capital, Chief Justice Naomi Bishop rose from her desk. She had been in her new office for 11 days. She had a stack of cases and a wall of law books and a title that made powerful people nervous. But right now she was only a daughter, and her mother was crying on the phone. Mama, tell me what happened, slowly. And Cora told her. The lien, the judge who wouldn't read her papers, the bag dumped on the floor. You people. Your kind. Samuel's watch, shattered, the word crawl, the handcuffs, the cell she was sitting in right now with bruised wrists and one loose shoe, all of it, in under 2 minutes. Chief Justice Naomi Bishop did not speak for 5 full seconds, and that silence was louder than anything Franklin Vance had shouted all morning. When she finally spoke, her voice was very calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm rips the roof clean off a house. Mama, she said, don't say another word to anyone, not one. I am going to handle this. Okay, baby, Cora whispered. Naomi hung up. She stood there a moment with her hand still on the phone. Then she did the thing she knew she had to do. Even though every part of her wanted to get in a car and drive, she could not touch this case herself. It was her own mother. If she stepped in directly, a guilty man might one day walk free on a technicality. She would recuse herself completely, stay 100 miles away from it in the eyes of the law. So instead she picked up the phone and called the one person who could act, and act now. Ruth Callahan, the chief administrative judge for the county, the woman who oversaw every judge in that courthouse, including Franklin Vance. Callahan answered on the first ring. Chief Justice, what an honor to, Ruth. Listen to me carefully. One of your judges just held my mother in contempt and threw her in a cell, Harmon County Courthouse, Judge Vance. My mother is 74 years old, she is black, and she did nothing but ask him to read her papers. I am recusing myself from every part of this. But I need you to go down there. Get her out, then call me back. A pause. Then Ruth Callahan's voice, hard as iron. I'm already reaching for my coat. Ruth Callahan walked into the Harmon County Courthouse, 18 minutes later, her badge on her hip and fury in her eyes. She went straight past the front desk, without stopping, down the hall, to the holding area, and there she was, Cora May Bishop, 74 years old, sitting on a metal bench under a buzzing light, one shoe loose, a purple bruise blooming on her wrist, the pieces of a broken watch cupped in a handkerchief in her lap. Ruth had met Cora once before. 2 years ago, at a county event, this same woman had pressed a slice of homemade pound cake into her hands and said, "You work too hard, honey, eat something." Ruth had never forgotten it. Now she knelt on the cold floor in front of that same woman, in her good suit, and took both her hands. "Miss Cora," she said quietly, "I am so sorry. We are getting you out of here right now." Cora looked at her with tired, swollen eyes and squeezed her hands once. That was all the strength she had left. Ruth stood. She turned to the officer at the desk, and her voice came out like ice wrapped around steel. She should never have worn a single cuff. Get her a chair with a cushion, get her water, and bring me every record of what happened in Judge Vance's courtroom this morning. The transcript, the recording, all of it. Now. They brought Cora water and a soft chair. Ruth Callahan sat beside her, while the contempt paperwork was torn up in front of her eyes. And it was there, in that quiet moment, that Cora said the thing that would become the heartbeat of everything that came after. "You're kind, honey," she said softly, "and I know my daughter will take care of me. But I keep thinking." She paused, and her voice went very quiet. "What about the ones who don't have a daughter to call? The women like me who sit in that cell, and nobody comes. What happens to them?" Ruth Callahan didn't answer right away, because the truth was heavy, and Cora had just placed it right in her hands. "That," Ruth said at last, "is the question I am going to spend the rest of this thing answering." Then she straightened her jacket, and she walked down the hall toward Judge Vance's chambers with the kind of stride that makes walls pay attention. Somewhere behind that door, Franklin Vance was hanging up his robe, pleased with his morning's work. He had no idea that in about 90 seconds, his entire life was going to collapse. Vance was pouring himself a fresh cup of coffee when Ruth Callahan opened his door without knocking. He turned, half a smile on his face. "Ruth, what brings the administrative judge all the way down to, tell me about the woman you held in contempt this morning, the code violation?" He shrugged and sipped. "Some woman who wouldn't stop arguing, refused my orders, disrupted the court. Textbook contempt. Why?" Ruth let the silence sit. 5 seconds. 10. Vance shifted on his feet. "Do you know who that woman is?" she asked. His smile flickered. "Should I? That woman is Cora Bishop. She is the mother of Naomi Bishop." Ruth watched his face carefully. The new Chief Justice of this state. The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth, and his smile didn't just fade. It collapsed, like someone pulled a plug and drained every drop of color from his face in half a second. I had no way of knowing that," he stammered. "There's no way I could have." "Stop." Ruth's voice dropped low, every word sharpened to a point. "Let me be very clear. Even if that woman were nobody, even if she had no connection to a single soul on earth, you dumped her belongings on the floor. You broke an old woman's keepsake and told her to crawl. You said "you people" and "your kind" to a black grandmother, on the record, in open court, and then you jailed her on a charge you pulled out of thin air. That alone ends your career. The fact that she is the Chief Justice's mother just means the whole country is about to watch it happen." Vance set his cup down. His hand was shaking so badly it rattled against the desk. "Ruth, be reasonable. If I could just talk to her, apologize. We could work something out. Apologize." Ruth stared at him. "You think sorry fixes a bruise on a 74-year-old's wrist? You think a handshake puts a shattered watch back together? You think an apology gives her back that hour she sat in a cell for the color of her skin?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "Here is what happens now," Ruth said. "You are suspended from the bench, this second. You will not enter that courtroom again. You will not contact Mrs. Bishop. You will not contact one witness. The Judicial Standards Commission will handle you from here. And hear this." She leaned in. "Chief Justice Bishop has recused herself completely. She will not lift a finger to help you or hurt you, which means there is no one left in this entire state to protect you. You did every bit of this yourself, and it is all on tape." Vance went white. "On what tape?" "The courtroom recording, Judge. It was on the whole time, every word." Ruth almost smiled. "You buried yourself this morning, and you didn't even notice you were holding the shovel." She turned and walked out. And Franklin Vance sank slowly into his chair, alone in his chambers, staring at a cup of coffee he no longer had the stomach to drink. The story might have ended there. A quiet suspension, a private matter, handled behind closed doors. But that is not what happened, because 3 people in that courtroom had refused to stay silent. By that evening, Theo Alvarez had handed the audio file to Ruth Callahan's office. Marcy Delgado had submitted her true, unedited transcript, and Harriet Cole, the retired attorney, had written down everything she witnessed and signed her name to it. Then Harriet made one more call, to a journalist she trusted, a local investigative reporter named Simone Carter, who had spent years writing about the people the system chewed up and forgot. Simone drove to Delacroix Street the next morning. She sat in Cora's kitchen and drank coffee and listened. She saw the empty dish on the wall shelf where the pocket watch used to rest. She heard the whole story in a soft, tired voice. Then Simone Carter went home and she wrote. Her article went up 2 days later, under a headline that would soon be everywhere. A judge told a black grandmother to crawl. She was the new Chief Justice's mother. By that night it had been shared 40,000 times. By the weekend the audio was on every news channel in the state. Vance's own voice, saying, "You people," saying, "Your kind," saying, "Crawl," playing over and over and over. And once one thread was pulled, the whole thing began to unravel. The Judicial Standards Commission opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. They started with the recording. Vance's voice, cold and clear, caught every word. The "you people," the "your kind," the invented contempt charge. Every second of it admissible. There is no arguing with a man's own voice. Then they pulled his record, and that is when the real damage began. 11 complaints. 11. Over 9 years, 11 different people had filed formal complaints against Judge Franklin Vance. Racial bias from the bench, abuse of the contempt power, demeaning black and poor defendants, denying people the right to speak. Every single complaint had been reviewed by the court's administrative staff under the old leadership, and every single one had been quietly dismissed, marked unfounded, marked insufficient evidence, filed away in a drawer. 11 people had raised their hands and said, "This man is dangerous, and he treats us like we are less than human." 11 times, the system looked away. Not anymore. The commission named 2 administrators who had personally signed off on burying those complaints. Both were suspended. One of them had signed off on 6 of the 11, and would soon face a separate federal investigation for obstruction. The drawer was finally open, and everything inside it came pouring out into the light. Then the victims came forward. Within a week, 7 of the 11 told their stories publicly, to Simone Carter, to state reporters, to anyone who would listen. A young black father who came to court over a broken taillight and left with a contempt fine so large he lost his apartment. A 19-year-old girl Vance mocked for her braids and her accent before jailing her overnight for talking back. An immigrant grandmother who asked for an interpreter was denied one, and then was held in contempt when she couldn't understand the questions being fired at her. Story after story, different faces, different days, same judge, same cold contempt for anyone who didn't look like him, and every one of them said a version of the same thing. "I told someone. I filed the paper. Nothing ever happened. I thought I was the only one. They were never the only one. They had just been alone. And now, for the first time, they weren't." Cora Bishop read every single one of their stories at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on, and each time she finished one, she folded her hands, closed her eyes, and said a small prayer for the person in it, because these were exactly the people she had been crying for that day in the hall, the ones with no daughter to call. Now the whole country was finally listening. The hearing began 3 months later, in the largest courtroom in the county, standing room only, every single day. Local residents, reporters from across the country, civil rights attorneys, and in the front row every morning, without fail, sat Cora May Bishop. Back straight, hands folded, new glasses on her nose, both shoes on her feet, and in her coat pocket, wrapped in the same handkerchief, sat Samuel's pocket watch, repaired now, the glass replaced, the gears cleaned and set right by an old clockmaker 2 towns over who refused to take a single dollar for the work. It ticked again, soft and steady, right against her heart. The case against Vance was overwhelming. The audio recording, played in full. Marcy Delgado's honest transcript, every word intact. Harriet Cole's testimony, calm and devastating. The medical record of the bruise on Cora's wrist. And the file of 11 buried complaints, laid out one by one, like nails going into a coffin. Vance's lawyer tried everything. He called it a routine hearing that got out of hand. He said his client had followed procedure. He claimed the old woman had been combative. Then the prosecution played the recording again. And Cora's voice came through the courtroom speakers, soft, polite, saying, "Your Honor," and "Sir," and "Please," while a man's voice roared at her to crawl. After that, the whole room already knew how this would end. Against his own lawyer's advice, Franklin Vance took the stand on the 4th day. Under questioning, he contradicted his own written report 3 times in the first 20 minutes. He referred to Cora as "that woman" 6 separate times. And when the prosecutor asked him one simple question, "Judge Vance, would you have said, 'you people,' and 'crawl' to a 74-year-old white grandmother sitting in that same chair?" He sat in silence for 4 full seconds before he said, "That's not relevant." The whole room heard those 4 seconds. Everyone did. That silence answered the question better than any word could have. The commission's decision came down 2 weeks later, and then the criminal court took its turn, and the verdicts landed one after another, like doors slamming shut. Removed from the bench, permanently, disbarred, his license to practice law revoked, so he would never sit in a courtroom in any role again. And then, the criminal conviction, abuse of official power, false imprisonment, and violation of Cora Bishop's civil rights under color of law. The sentence: prison time, real time, no early release. His name entered into a federal database of civil rights violators, so that no court in the country would ever let him near a bench again. The two administrators who had buried the complaints were both fired. One faced federal charges, and young Kyle Danner, the bailiff who had looked away, received probation and 500 hours of community service, and was permanently barred from any courthouse job. When the final sentence was read, the packed courtroom did not cheer, it exhaled. The long, shaking breath a room lets out when something that should have happened a very long time ago finally does. Cora sat in the front row. She did not clap. She did not cry. She closed her eyes and nodded once, slowly, like a prayer had at last been answered. But the ending of this story is not a prison cell. Cora Bishop would never have wanted it to be. When the state offered to name a wing of the courthouse after her, she said no. When they wanted a plaque with her face on it, she shook her head and smiled. "I'm not the face of anything," she said. "I'm just a seamstress who went to court to fix a mistake." But she asked them for one thing instead. 6 months later, in the same courthouse where she had once been dragged out in handcuffs, a new program began. They called it the Courtroom Companion Program, and the idea was simple, and it was hers. Trained volunteers, retired teachers, church members, former defendants, ordinary people who would sit beside anyone who had to face a judge alone. Anyone poor, or frightened, or old, or black, or unable to speak the language, or simply scared of a room built to make them feel small, so that no one would ever again stand on that cold marble floor with no one at their side. Harriet Cole helped write the training. Marcy Delgado signed up the very first week, and Ruth Callahan made sure every judge in the county understood the program carried the full weight of her office behind it. And on a bright morning that spring, sunlight pouring through the tall courthouse windows, you could have found Cora Mae Bishop sitting in that very courtroom, not in handcuffs, not on trial. She sat in the second row beside a trembling young man who was facing an eviction with no lawyer and no family in the world. She leaned over and whispered to him, the way she used to calm frightened children in the church nursery. "Breathe, baby. Just breathe. You are not alone in here. I'm right beside you, and I'm not going anywhere." In her coat pocket, Samuel's watch ticked softly against her heart. At the front of the room, a new judge, young and fair, read the case carefully, every page, the way it was always meant to be done. And in the back of the gallery, unseen, in a plain coat with no robe, sat Chief Justice Naomi Bishop, watching her mother work, with tears standing in her eyes. Cora had said it best, months before, sitting in that holding cell with bruised wrists. What about the ones who don't have a daughter to call? Now they had someone. They had a companion. They had a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to stand alone on that floor, judged for the color of her skin, and who had decided that no one else would ever have to stand there alone again, because in the end, she understood the one thing Franklin Vance never did. Power is not about what you can do to the people you think are beneath you. It is about who you choose to stand beside when no one else will. And Cora Mae Bishop chose to stand beside every last one of them. If this story moved you, remember Cora's question, what about the ones with no one to call? Share it for every person who was ever made to feel they didn't belong. Comment below, have you ever watched a wrong happen and stayed silent and wished you hadn't? And subscribe for more stories where quiet, decent people finally get the justice they were owed all along.